Hi everyone, and welcome to the Advanced Rehab presentation, 5 Tips for Community Access, Leisure and Recreation. The presentation today is conducted by myself, Lucy Forbes, an occupational therapist. Today in the presentation we will be looking at what is appropriate and planning outings. We'll just run through a couple of definitions at the start involving community access. So community access is the physical access to environments external to the home. It encompasses the travel to and from, as well as the tasks performed in the community. This would include travel to and from clinics, to and from the doctor's surgeries, and to and from the shops. Leisure and recreation encompasses the activities that we engage in for enjoyment, relaxation, or personal growth. The recreation and leisure activity usually holds personal value to that individual. Session outline. Some of the things that we'll cover today include an introduction, and then we go through the 5 different tips for community access, including planning and preparation of your trip, identification of relevant activities, equipment use, which may be relevant for the individual, transportation options, and also the role of occupational therapy. As an introduction, community access, recreation, and leisure activities are a critical dimension in the quality of life for all people. However, many people are still limited to segregated recreation and leisure choices. It's important to note that while not all people with disabilities or mobility restrictions need support to participate in recreation and leisure activities, some people with mobility limitations, disability, or those which require the use of equipment when out and about may occasionally require supports to access and participate in valued leisure and recreation activities. So our first tip involves the planning and preparation of your community access trip. It's important to note that the community activity selected is appropriate for the individual to engage in. Some of the questions you might like to review include: has the activity been selected by the individual? Is that activity appropriate for the client to participate in? And do they have staffing, equipment, and/or the transportation needed to engage in that activity safely? It is important that the individual remains engaged in the activity and that it is within their personal interests. When you are considering if the activity is appropriate, think about elements such as functional capacity. So when we refer to functional capacity, we are speaking about their ability to complete activities such as transfers, so that is sitting in a wheelchair and then standing up, completing a transfer in and out of a car, their capacity to walk and the duration in which they're able to walk, or if they're able to self-propel in a wheelchair. We also look at skills, so their ability to handle goods and items if they go to the shops, their ability to manage money, their use of escalators and elevators, and also the level of experience. So have they participated in activities similar to that before, such as have they been to crowded places such as shopping centres? Would they be aware of how to find their seat in a darkened movie theatre? Or are they able to use public bathrooms which may be different from their own home setup? This can include things like rails located in different places in the bathroom. There may be a swing door rather than a sliding door to access, or a button push to get in and out. If you are unsure about any new areas which the individual may be exposed to during community access and leisure tasks, it's recommended that the area is explored by the carer prior to that activity being done. So some of the things to have a look out for if you're a carer is when you go to the shop, have a look around. Where would be the places for that person to sit? Where are the escalators located, or where are the elevators located? If you're looking to take that person to a garden, where are the paths and the shady areas? Same with parks. Are there uneven areas? Are there birds nesting? In cafes, have a look at the circulation space available around the tables and the height of the bench for the service area. Identifying leisure activities. Tip 2. In figuring out how to best assist a person to be involved in recreation and leisure activities, it's important to begin by getting to know the person. This involves spending time with the person and with others who know him or her well. The individualization of community access and leisure activities means that the person is engaged in those activities as they find them meaningful and worthwhile. This enhances quality of life and promotes engagement in community access and social activities. It's also important to note that increasing community access and leisure can have many benefits for the individual, such as increased cardiovascular endurance. Often community access trips require longer physical engagement than home-based activities. This can be from the activity required when on community access, such as walking, pushing a wheelchair, using a trolley, or engaging in a physical leisure activity such as woodwork or hydrotherapy. Increased community access has also been linked to greater self-confidence and decreased feelings of social isolation, which is very prevalent in some of the communities. Some of the ways that we can identify leisure activities is through the use of a leisure checklist. It can be a great way to help identify a range of interests and to promote engagement in a varied range of activities, which are tailored to the individual's personal preference. There are a number of examples of leisure checklists, and I don't have a particular preference. I've listed an example below, which you can have a look at. That's the website name, and if you can follow that link, or you can type that into your web bar and it'll pop up with a leisure checklist. So a leisure checklist or something similar can be a fantastic prompt to exploring the range of leisure activities which an individual may be interested in. Often it's observed that leisure and recreation activities become the same each week, such as an individual going to the shops to have a coffee and watch a movie with their carer or family member. Also, we note that group trips are often planned to larger locations, such as a shop or a local community facility, as they're often able to accommodate the size of the party. Usually the members of the group each engage in the same activity, such as watching a movie or going to the cafe. While this may be a meaningful activity for some of those individuals, there could be other interests which they might like to explore. In the particular leisure checklist which I've listed, you can find activities in different categories such as health and fitness, looking at complementary therapies and swimming and yoga, as well as sports, creative pursuits such as singing, making music, writing, photography, and woodwork. Also, there is productivity at home, such as cooking or baking, and leisure, such as playing cards, television, and radio. Some of the social activities noted would be eating out or visiting friends and families, engaging in volunteering work or church activities. There's also a section for outdoor pursuits that can include gardening, bird watching, and horse riding. Some of the other sections include out and about or entertainment. So day trips to car boot sales and jumble fairs, travelling and dancing, going to the concerts or doing bingo, as well as an educational section, such as attending lectures or adult education courses, engaging in science or foreign languages. Individualised trips are often planned in conjunction with the person themselves, post-identification of a need or desire of that individual. They can therefore be much more tailored in their outcome. The use of a leisure checklist is just a prompt to explore these interests. In the past, some of the community activities and leisure tasks which I focused on includes exploring interests such as a client wanting to be independent in going to the shops to buy a newspaper in their own language, or another who was keen to access a weekly bridge group for cards and socialisation. Additionally, I had someone that was interested in going to and from the shops independently because they needed to pick up objects such as butter for baking tasks, or another lady who wanted to join the community garden club in their local area so they could tend to the vegetable garden, control the native plants and weeds in their local area. This is a simple graph representation. It's taken from the American Time Use Survey in 2013 and just shows a graphical representation of the average population over the day. It simply assists with demonstrating the varied leisure interests of different people. Individuals with a change in physical mobility, cognitive status, or those who rely on mobility equipment often still have a wide range of leisure activities which would be similar to this graph. It's important to ensure that these activities are supported. Tip 3, equipment use. So what we like to do is ensure there's a match between the equipment used and the individual themselves. It's key in ensuring success for community access trip. It's important to note that whilst an individual around the home may only use some equipment, or perhaps none at all, this can often vary from what is required during community access trips. As noted before, this can be due to the increased physical and cognitive demands when in the community, such as going for longer durations, traversing over rocky ground in a park, or getting on and off a bus. Wheelchairs. So what you can see here is some picture demonstrations. You can't see my cursor, but in the top left-hand corner, I just put that picture in as an example. I've never scripted a wheelchair such as that, but it just, it looked like it would definitely navigate over some rocky terrain. So in the top right, you'll also see what's called a power wheelchair or an electric wheelchair. Now that electric wheelchair is fitted with a headrest, which you can see up the top, and also electric wheelchairs are perfect to be fitted with transport tie-down points to allow them to access wheelchair accessible vehicles. In the bottom left-hand corner with the white background is a simple self-propelled manual wheelchair. You can tell the difference between a self-propelled manual wheelchair and an attendant-propelled manual wheelchair by the rear wheels. As you will notice in the bottom picture on the left-hand side, the wheels at the back are quite large and they encompass a silver rim which the person can use to push themselves along, thus acquiring the name self-propelled wheelchair. In the bottom right-hand side, the picture of the man in the park with the gentleman in the wheelchair, you'll notice that the rear wheels on the back of that wheelchair are a lot smaller, thus being called an attendant-propelled wheelchair. An attendant-propelled wheelchair has no capacity for the individual in the wheelchair to propel themselves. They simply rely on a caregiver to move them from place to place. Some of the other things to think about with wheelchairs are fixed versus folding frame. So with a fixed frame wheelchair, there's no capacity to fold the seat up and collapse the wheelchair. Some of the advantages of this obviously means that there are less breakable points in the wheelchair. So if you've noticed that you've frequently broken some of the elements on your wheelchair, it may be worthwhile looking into a fixed frame wheelchair. Additionally, a fixed frame wheelchair can quite often be much, much lighter, as it means there are not so many movable components. However, one of the other elements are a folding frame wheelchair. So with the one on the bottom left-hand side, that would be a folding frame wheelchair. You lift from the base of the seat upwards towards the armrest and the wheelchair will collapse in on itself, which is referred to as a folding frame wheelchair. One of the advantages of a folding frame wheelchair is that it can be utilised by carers to load in and out of the boot of the car. Some of the other wheelchairs are the electric wheelchairs, which are up in the top right-hand side. That's the blue wheelchair with the joystick. You can get different types of joystick for the person to propel themselves, and you can get different types of seating systems. An electric wheelchair is a great script for someone that doesn't have the capacity to push themselves along, but has the cognitive capacity to get themselves from A to B if provided with the opportunity. There are also tilt-in-space wheelchairs, which have the capacity for the seat to be tilted back into a recline position. This can be particularly handy when going up and down curbs if the person has a tendency to shift forward in the wheelchair. Other accessories include handle brakes versus manual braking or caster brakes. So they would be a gas-assisted brake similar to maybe what you would find on a push bike, and you squeeze the brakes at the back where the handles are. That would be a handle brake with the carer who is controlling the speed of the wheelchair. There are also caster brakes, which the client can put on themselves. They would be wheel locks just down the bottom near those larger wheels. Some of the other accessories which are important to note for a wheelchair is the use of a headrest. A headrest is legally required by law if the person is travelling in their wheelchair in a vehicle. So that would be if the person went out in their wheelchair in a wheelchair accessible taxi or a wheelchair accessible van. So for example, the wheelchairs, both of them on the bottom, would not be appropriate to use in a wheelchair taxi, as they are not fitted with headrests and do not comply with law. Some of the other accessories include pressure care. So that would be the seating system which the person is sitting on. If the person has any sore patches on their skin or has pressure wounds in the past, it's important to consider pressure care when going out and about in the community, because that person will be using their wheelchair for quite a long duration for that activity. You can speak to your occupational therapist if you have any concerns about the person's pressure care. Some of the other mobility aids which we frequently see include what's called a quad stick. So that's up on your top left-hand side. It's got a 4-prong base and it's a wider base of support than a standard single-point stick. I've also put in a picture of crutches. Whilst not commonly used for a long-term mobility aid, occasionally you do see people using those in the shops, particularly if they have a broken leg. One of the more common mobility aids One of the more common mobility aids includes the 4-wheel walker or the seat walker, which you can see positioned on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. The seat walker is great as it has a seat on it which you can use for a seated rest break, which is particularly handy if you're out and about in a shopping centre or the grocery store where there's not typically a lot of seats around. The handle brakes can be pushed down and then locked into position, and the person can sit down and rest on that. It's also important to note that your mobility aid matches with the person's capacity. So if they only have the use of one arm, such as those post-stroke, it's important to consider whether or not a stick is appropriate for them to use whilst in the shops, as they would be therefore unable to carry anything if they bought it, because they would be using the stick in their good hand. Tip 4. How do we get there? So many individuals are reliant on transportation from family and friends, as they do not feel comfortable with other transportation options. This may be because of a change in physical or cognitive status, or there may have been little or no exposure to other transport options, such as retraining in public transport or use of wheelchair accessible vehicles. I'll just briefly touch on car modifications. It's quite a large element of modifications which can be done and is very complex, but I'll just show you a couple of the different options. On the top left-hand side, you can see a car hoist. So that person has been sitting in a wheelchair and the hoist has been applied around them, and she is being swung into the passenger seat of the standard car. So the hoist is mounted onto the car. That would mean that the carer then takes the wheelchair round to the back of the car or to the back seat, and the carer loads the wheelchair in and out of the car. That individual remains in the passenger seat for the duration of the car trip, and then the hoist is used again to get her out of the car and back into her wheelchair. So this means that she can maintain sitting in a regular vehicle in the front passenger seat. In the next picture, on the top right-hand side, you'll notice that the platform lift has been installed on the back of this van. Typically, platform lifts are installed only for larger vans, such as those used for group homes or for permanent wheelchair transport. So with the platform lift, that one is in an elevated position, so it's level with the back of the van. That platform lift drops horizontally down to the ground, and the person is wheeled onto that platform lift, and then the button is pressed. You'll notice that there is a control there on the right-hand side. It's a grey box with red markings on it, and then it's lifted up into a horizontal position, so it's level with the back of the van, and the yellow bit at the front has dropped down, allowing that person to be moved forward into the van. With the use of a platform lift, and also when travelling in a wheelchair in the car, it's important to have the car fixed with tie-down points. You can't see into this back of the van, but there would be tracks along the floor which include hooks which you can then attach to the wheelchair and fasten into place. You cannot rely on the brakes of a wheelchair during car travel transport. If someone applies the car brakes, that person will come out of the wheelchair unless those tie-down points are fixed in. On the bottom picture, you'll notice that there is a ramp which is being used to load this individual in and out of the car. So it's important to note the clearance room between the head and the top of the van, because right at the top of that ramp, there's what's called a crest point. So that's when the person goes up into the van before they level off into the back of the van. So you just have to make sure that their head is clear from the top of the van, which we quite often have to consider when we're scripting what kind of hoist goes into the back of the car. You need to have a very wide opening at the back of the van to allow for sufficient head clearance and for clearance of the seat, the headrest of the wheelchair, which can be slightly higher than the person's head itself, as you can see in that picture. So when you're scripting or having a look at car modifications, you have to think about what the individual themselves can do. Are they able to do what's called a standing pivot transfer? So are they able to stand up out of their wheelchair and pivot down into the passenger seat? In that case, car modifications are likely not required, as then the wheelchair or the mobility aid can then be loaded into the boot of the vehicle. Would they be appropriate to have a hoist for the car, or do they need to travel in the wheelchair itself? If you have a manual wheelchair for the individual in question, which may be a folding or a fixed frame, consider where you load that manual wheelchair. Does it need to be lifted into the boot of the car, or can it simply be loaded in the back seat, behind the back passenger seat, between the seats themselves? It often means that the wheelchair can then just be tilted back onto its rear wheels and loaded into the car without a substantial lift. Please talk to your occupational therapist about these issues, and they will be able to run you through car modifications and how to load and unload a wheelchair into a car. Also, have a think about the capacity of the carer themselves. Are they able to attach a sling around the person, or are they able to load and unload a wheelchair in and out the boot of the car? We also have to think about the use of the hoist itself. Are all these types of hoists appropriate and compatible with the type of car that you have? As I've mentioned before, car modifications can be quite a complex issue, and if you have a particular car which you think that you'd like to modify, please talk to your occupational therapist, and they will be able to direct you to a car modifications service, which will be able to look at the car and see if it is compatible. It's also worthwhile noting that some cars can be pre-modified. Some of the other car modifications which are available. So what we notice here in the top left-hand picture is an individual who's sitting in the driver's seat of his car, and he's dismantling his wheelchair and loading it into the passenger seat of his car. Quite often a lot of our younger, more able-bodied clients are able to do this, to pop the wheels off their wheelchair and bring the whole frame of the chair across and load it into the side passenger seat. And they're able to do this transfer independently, both in and out of the car. They deconstruct the wheelchair when getting into the car and then reconstruct it again, popping the wheels back on and clicking them into place before completing a sliding transfer. On the top right-hand side, what you'll notice is a wheelchair hoist, where the individual has loaded themselves into the car and the hoist has taken the wheelchair right up on top of the car. And in the bottom picture, I've just popped in an example of someone loading and unloading a wheelchair from the boot of the car. A wheelchair is a very large and awkwardly shaped item, and it is quite difficult from a manual handling perspective. So what you'll notice here is she's got the load as close as she can to her body, and she's lifted it up and is bringing it forward, keeping it on the strongest part of her core. So have a think about some safe lifting techniques when you're loading your wheelchair in and out of the car, or whether or not it has to be loaded in and out of the boot of the car at all, as I mentioned before. It can often be loaded into the back seat instead. Also have to consider the frequency of use of the wheelchair and how often that individual is going in and out into the community. Consider the carer's capacity to frequently load the wheelchair in and out, and also the instances of any pain or sensation changes whilst doing that. It may be worthwhile considering modifying the vehicle if community access is completed frequently. Some of the other things to have a bit of a chat about today include public transport. So what you'll notice here is a picture on the left-hand side is a drop step, which is available on some of the public buses, which are available in New South Wales and Australia. And on the top right-hand side, you'll notice that there's a picture of the inside of the bus. On both the left and the right-hand side, they've got sections which you can travel inside in a wheelchair. You have to face backwards and have the brakes locked during all bus transport. I've also included a picture of stairs there, as this is commonly seen when going to and from public transport. So a lowered step height, or the bus lowering themselves down with their gas-assisted lift, can assist with entering and exiting the bus. There's also rails when entering and exiting the bus for those using a stick or a frame. The wheelchair bases on bus services must be used if you're travelling in a wheelchair, and you must always face backwards with the brakes on. There's a button on the bus which also allows you to stop the bus as required or signal to the driver. Some services are listed as disability friendly. Look at tripplanner.com.au and note the wheelchair symbol next to some of the bus services. And also check for interchanges as required. These can often not link up if you need a disability friendly service. You have to check that both buses are disability friendly. So what I've got here is an example of the Sydney transport system. If you zoomed in on this map, you would notice that some of them have the disability accessible pictures next to them. And again, I've just included that picture of the stairs. So choose train stations with lift access, although it's not available at all stations. It's also recommended that you call ahead if it's your first time completing this task to ensure availability of staff. Disability-friendly stations can have a platform guard who can assist with the use of an access ramp to enter and exit the train if you're using a mobility device or a wheelchair. You have to go down near the station conductor, and he will assist you with putting the ramp out. There's also wider ticket gates for wheelchair and mobility equipment users when checking their tickets. As per prior, if you're unsure about any new areas which the individual may be exposed to during community access and leisure tasks, it's recommended that the area is explored by the carer before this is completed. This obviously includes the use of the bus and train stations. Check the interchanges particularly to ensure that they are disability friendly. Have a look. Does it require a platform change, or does a road need to be crossed if you're changing buses? What's the distance between these? Is the person able to cross the road in time? Is there anywhere to sit and wait for the train and bus? And how are you going to get to the bus stop or the train station? Is there somewhere to rest along the way if you need to take a seated break? Do curbs need to be navigated? Does the carer have capacity to assist the individual up a ramp if needed? Or are there unavoidable stairs? Can the client complete this, or does someone need to lift the walker or wheelchair up and down the stairs? It wouldn't be a presentation by an occupational therapist without one of the tips being the role of occupational therapy. So what we can do for the individual is have a look at the range of leisure activities which they might be interested in, and look at the carer requirements for community access. So the range of activities that will assist a client to become motivated and engage in community access trips promotes physical engagement in that activity. Such examples include the holistic task of cooking. So that might be the person completes a meal prep plan, engages in community access to the shops, so that's getting the bus or the train to the shops, collecting and shopping for the ingredient, and then coming back and completing the cooking task. Community access retraining may focus on grading this activity. So over time, the support is reduced and the person can complete this task in an independent manner. Whilst we haven't touched a lot on behavioural and community triggers for clients, it's important to note that this will be assessed by the occupational therapist, such as when a carer assistance may or may not be required. So having a look at things like, is this individual stimulated by excessive noise or fast-moving objects, such things as small spaces and loud noises and breakable items around them? So having a look at road safety and awareness of that client. So the occupational therapist is able to assess the navigation of crossings, the use of footpaths, and the visual scanning of that individual. The completion of this can significantly affect the carer requirements for community access. If the person presents with a significant neglect on one side and is therefore not able to scan and notify things on their neglected side, they will require assistance for all community access tasks, anything to do with road safety. An important aspect of community training is to ensure the education surrounding money management. This may include a review and counting of money, selection of goods within a strict budget, and the interaction with sales staff and use of automated checkouts. We also have a look at the capacity of the individual to utilize money ATMs and money machines, and as well as completing banking via phone or in person. And re-scripting equipment. So it's important to note that as per road safety regulations, a client travelling in a wheelchair must have a headrest fitted to his or her wheelchair, as well as the wheelchair being fitted with tie-down points. Your occupational can assess for a wheelchair that would be easy to propel in the community over long durations. The client may benefit from such accessories, including pressure care or e-motion wheels, to assist with this. It's important to consider that pressure care and your wheelchair may need re-scripting, especially if they've been spending a long amount of time in the wheelchair or their pressure care needs have changed. There will now be a short video demonstrating community access tips for carers taking a wheelchair into the community. Please also note that at one point in the presentation, there is a demonstration of ramp use, where there are cable brakes on the wheelchair. So these are the squeeze brakes which I was talking about before, which the carer is utilising on the back of the wheelchair. However, in the event that you encounter a ramp or a gradient surface which you think may be difficult to handle if you've got a client in a wheelchair, it's recommended that you turn the wheelchair around and proceed down the ramp backwards. This is particularly important if the client is heavier than you or if they have poor seated balance, as they may tip forward in the chair if you go down the ramp or the curb forwards. The video is also based in London, and you'll have to excuse the music.
It's also wise to take any medication with you, just in case. Before you start to move, make sure the hands are resting safely on the lap and not hanging down so that they may get caught in the wheels. Here's a tip when pushing a chair over the gravel. Wheel the chair backwards, allowing the bigger wheels to run smoothly over the stones. Try to plan your journey, especially if you're considering public transport. Will there be stairs or wheelchair access at the end? Will there be a disabled toilet if needed? Also, know your limits. Don't plan a long journey unless you have enough stamina to push the boat. Remember to pace yourself and leave plenty of time for your journey. Take a break if needed along the way. All wheelchairs have brakes installed on the wheels. Ensure these are applied when you are stationary, especially when travelling in a bus or in a taxi. As Neil is heavier than myself, I ensure the wheelchair we ordered came with handle brakes. These give me extra control when slowing the wheelchair down and up slopes. When crossing a road, look for the nearest dropped curb. Some dropped curbs are smoother than others, so always slow when pushing the wheelchair over these. If there aren't any dropped curbs when needed, and you are sure you have the strength, then you can perform a kick tilt. Try to avoid going down the curb forwards, as this would throw a person out of the wheelchair. Instead, reverse the chair slowly over the curb and down, using the handle brakes to slow the descent. You can apply a foot to the boat stabilizers to slow the front of the chair down as it lowers. If you need to bring the wheelchair up a curb and you have the strength to do it, ensure the stabilizers are turned upwards to allow the chair to tilt further back. Once the front of the chair is resting on the pavement, lift the back of the chair up and push forwards. Once safely on the pavement, ensure you turn the stabilizers back into their normal position. When outside, be aware of bumps and potholes. Also, be aware of other people on the pavement. Be aware some drop curbs can be more awkward. If this is the case, reverse the wheelchair, allowing for the larger back wheels to maneuver more easily over the curb. When encountering a slope, be aware of your weight difference, as this will affect how easy it will be to cope with the gradient. If the slope appears too steep, look for another option. Also, be aware of your strength limitations and ensure the lap belt is secured. If using a ramp, make sure it is stable and will bear the overall weight. Be aware of the sides of the ramp, ensuring the wheels do not come off the tip of the chair. I hope you found this video helpful. The information has come from our own personal insight whilst using the wheelchair.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks for watching. If you've got any additional questions, please go to archealth.com.au.